When you refuse to defend yourself, something unusual happens. You become unclear, not weak, not passive, unclear. And in a world that depends on certainty, that lack of clarity is dangerous, because people don't fear what they understand. They fear what they can't predict, what they can't read, what they can't control. Most people rush to explain themselves, to clarify, to defend. They believe clarity protects them, but clarity also exposes them. It gives others something to hold, something to attack, something to control. But when you give nothing, no explanation, no emotional signal, no clear reaction, you become a question, and questions create tension. This is the shadow tactic. Not loud, not aggressive, but deeply unsettling. Because when there is no clear target, every attack loses direction, and the one who remains undefined cannot be easily controlled. 1. Clarity creates targets. Clarity feels like safety. When something goes wrong, when you're questioned, challenged, or accused, your instinct is simple. Explain. Make everything clear. Tell your side. Correct the misunderstanding. Remove the doubt. Because in your mind, clarity protects you. If they understand you, they'll stop. If they see the truth, the pressure disappears. But that's not what happens. In conflict, clarity does not protect you. It exposes you. The moment you begin to explain, you start defining yourself. You give structure to your thoughts. You reveal your reasoning. You show where you stand. And once you are defined, you become measurable. And anything that can be measured can be challenged. Every word you say becomes a point of entry. Every explanation becomes something to dissect. Not to understand you, but to find weakness. This is where most people lose control, because they think they are clarifying, when in reality, they are building a map of their logic, their emotions, their priorities. And once that map exists, others know exactly where to apply pressure. They know what you care about, what you're trying to protect, what you don't want misunderstood. And those points become leverage. They question your logic, twist your words, reframe your meaning, not because they're searching for truth, but because they now have something to work with, something to push against. This is how escalation begins, not from silence, but from explanation, because explanation invites response, and response invites more explanation, until the situation becomes a cycle. You explain, they challenge. You clarify, they reinterpret. You defend, they push further. And the more you speak, the deeper you go, not into resolution, but into exposure, because every new sentence adds detail, and detail creates more targets, more angles to attack, more points to question. This is why some arguments never end, not because they're complicated, but because they're overfed, fed with words, fed with emotion, fed with explanation. And the more you feed them, the stronger they become. This is the hidden cost of clarity. It doesn't just make things visible. It makes them vulnerable, because visibility invites pressure. Now compare that to someone who does not fully explain, someone who speaks, but leaves space, who responds, but does not define everything, who acknowledges, but does not clarify endlessly. That person is harder to engage, harder to challenge, harder to control, because there is no clear structure to attack, no fixed position to dismantle, no detailed explanation to dissect. There is only presence, and presence, without overdefinition, creates uncertainty, and uncertainty slows people down. It forces hesitation, because now, they don't know exactly where to aim. They don't know what you'll defend, what you'll ignore, what matters to you. And without that knowledge, their control weakens. This is the shift, from being understood to being unreadable, not completely hidden, but not fully exposed, because full exposure is what creates vulnerability, and vulnerability is what others use. This doesn't mean you never speak. It means you choose how much you reveal, because not every situation requires full clarity. Not every accusation deserves full explanation. Not every challenge needs to be answered in detail. Sometimes, less is stronger. Less explanation, less emotion, less exposure. Because when you reduce what you give, you reduce what can be used against you. This is the beginning of control. Not in what you say, but in what you choose not to say. And that choice is what removes the target. Because without a clear target, there is nothing precise to hit, only space. And in that space, you remain unpinned, undefined, untouchable. 2. The power of ambiguity. Ambiguity makes people uncomfortable. Not noise, not conflict, uncertainty, the absence of clarity. Because the human mind is designed to complete patterns, to find meaning, to create conclusions, to eliminate the unknown. When something is unclear, the mind doesn't stay neutral. It starts working, filling the gaps, building assumptions, searching for answers. And when no answer is given, keep searching. This is where ambiguity becomes powerful. Because instead of giving people something to respond to, you give them something to figure out. And figuring something out requires effort. Effort creates tension. And tension creates instability. Most people try to remove that instability immediately. They explain. They clarify. They define everything. Because clarity feels like control. But in doing so, they remove all uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there is nothing left to think about. No tension. No hesitation. No pause. Everything becomes predictable. And predictability is easy to manage, easy to challenge, easy to control. But ambiguity does the opposite. It interrupts certainty, creates a space where nothing is fully confirmed. You respond, but not completely. You speak, but without revealing everything. You engage, but without defining your position. And this creates a gap between what is said and what is understood. And inside that gap, the other person begins to search. They analyze your tone, your words, your pauses, looking for meaning, looking for certainty. But certainty never fully arrives. And because it doesn't, they begin to guess. And guessing is where control starts to shift. Because when someone is guessing, they are no longer directing the interaction. They are reacting to it, trying to interpret, trying to understand, trying to regain clarity. This is the reversal. Instead of you explaining yourself, they are trying to explain you. Instead of you proving your position, they are trying to define it. And in doing so, they become engaged, mentally invested, while you remain still, unrevealed, uncommitted. This creates something deeper than confusion, creates disorientation, because now, their expectations don't match reality. They expect reaction, but get restraint. They expect clarity, but receive ambiguity. They expect direction, but encounter silence. And when expectations break, people lose rhythm. They hesitate. They slow down. They question themselves. Because the pattern they rely on is no longer working. This is what makes ambiguity powerful. It doesn't attack. It disrupts. Quietly. Without force. Without confrontation. And because it is subtle, it is difficult to counter. You cannot argue with something undefined. You cannot challenge a position that hasn't been fully revealed. You cannot control a response that hasn't been given. This is the protection ambiguity provides. Not by hiding, but by limiting exposure. You are present, but not predictable. Visible, but not fully understood. And that partial visibility creates pressure, because the human mind needs completion. It needs answers. And when it cannot find them externally, creates them internally. This is where projection begins. People start assigning meaning to your silence. They must be thinking this. They probably feel that. They're reacting in this way. And those assumptions are not based on you. They are based on them. Their fears, their expectations, their interpretation. This is the hidden layer of ambiguity. It doesn't just create uncertainty. It reveals the other person, because in the absence of clarity, they expose their own thinking, their biases, their emotional state, their intentions, all without you saying anything more. This is why ambiguity must be controlled. Not random, not careless, intentional. You choose what to say, what to leave out, what to reveal partially, just enough to stay present, but not enough to be defined. This balance is what creates the shadow, a presence that is there, but not fully seen, understood, but not completely, and what is not completely understood cannot be fully controlled. This is the power of ambiguity, not confusion, but controlled uncertainty, not silence alone, but selective clarity, because power is not in saying everything. It is in deciding what remains unknown. 3. Frustration without a target. Frustration doesn't come from resistance, comes from absence. Not when someone fights back, but when there is nothing to fight. Most people are prepared for opposition. They expect disagreement. They expect defense. They expect reaction, because reaction gives direction. It gives them something to push against, something to shape, something to control. But when that reaction never comes, something breaks. The structure disappears. They push, but nothing moves. They question, but nothing opens. They provoke, but nothing responds. And without response, there is no feedback, no signal, no confirmation, no control. This is where frustration begins. Not loud at first, subtle, pause that lingers too long, a silence that feels incomplete, a moment that doesn't resolve, because they are waiting for your reaction, your explanation, your defense, but it never arrives. And the longer it doesn't, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because now they are alone in the interaction, speaking without being met, acting without effect. And this creates a void, a gap between action and response. And that gap creates pressure to fill it. So they try again. They repeat themselves, rephrase the accusation, push a little harder, trying to provoke movement, trying to restore control. But control cannot return without your participation. And because they don't realize that, they keep trying. More words, more emotion, more intensity, but every attempt only deepens the problem, because effort without response feels like failure, and failure creates urgency. Now they are no longer calm. They are invested, emotionally involved, trying to force a reaction, trying to make something happen. And in that effort, they begin to lose control. Their tone changes, their patience fades, their composure weakens, because they are no longer guiding the interaction. They are chasing it. This is the shift. At the beginning, they were applying pressure. Now, they are feeling it, because silence creates imbalance. One side remains still. The other side keeps moving. And the more one side moves, without resistance, the more exposed it becomes, because there is nothing to hide behind. No back and forth. No equal exchange. Just their behavior, standing alone. And when behavior stands alone, it becomes visible, clear, unfiltered. Their intentions become obvious, not through what you say, but through what they continue to do. This is where frustration turns into exposure, because now, they are no longer reacting to you. They are reacting to their own lack of control, repeating, pushing, escalating, trying to regain something that is no longer available. And the more they try, the more it reveals something deeper. Dependence. Dependence on your response. Dependence on your reaction. Dependence on your engagement. Because without it, they have nothing to work with. No direction. No leverage. No control. This is the reality most people never see. They think power comes from speaking louder, explaining more, fighting harder. But real power often comes from removing yourself from the pattern entirely, because once the pattern breaks, everything changes. The rhythm disappears, the structure collapses, the control shifts, not through force, but through absence. This is what makes the silent response so powerful. Not because it defeats the other person, but because it removes what they depend on. And when what they depend on disappears, they begin to unravel, slowly at first, then visibly, until eventually, the interaction loses momentum, not resolved, but exhausted, because without your reaction, there is nothing left to sustain it. No fuel, no direction, no purpose, only silence. And in that silence, the one who remains calm holds the power, because they were never pulled into the struggle, never forced into defense, never pushed into reaction. They simply allowed the situation to collapse on its own. This is frustration without a target. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but deeply destabilizing. Because when there is no target, every attack loses meaning, and the one who cannot be reached cannot be controlled. 4. Maintaining the shadow. Creating ambiguity is only the beginning. Maintaining it is where control is tested. Because the moment you step into uncertainty, pressure follows. Not always obvious, sometimes subtle. A question repeated, a look that lingers, a pause that demands resolution. People will try to pull you back into clarity, back into explanation, back into definition, back into something they can understand. Because ambiguity makes them uncomfortable, and discomfort demands resolution. So they push, not always aggressively, but persistently. They want answers, clear ones. They want to know where you stand, what you mean, what you're thinking. Because once they know, they regain control. And this is where most people break. Not at the first question, but at the second. The repeated pressure, the expectation that builds, the silence that starts to feel too long. And in that moment, they speak, they explain more, clarify deeper, reveal what they were holding back. And just like that, the shadow disappears. Because ambiguity cannot exist with over-explanation. The more you define, the less power you hold. This is why maintaining the shadow requires discipline. Not dramatic silence, not forced detachment, but consistency. You don't rush to answer. You don't fill every gap. You don't resolve every tension. You allow space to remain. And more importantly, you become comfortable inside that space. Because most people aren't. Silence makes them uneasy. Uncertainty makes them restless. They feel the need to fix it, to say something, to bring clarity back. But you don't. You stay still, not frozen, composed, present, but not fully revealed. This is what creates the shadow. Not absence, but partial presence. You are there. You are aware. You are engaged, but not completely accessible. And that partial accessibility creates tension, because people can sense you, but they cannot fully read you. And when they cannot read you, they begin to study you. They pay more attention, watch more closely, listen more carefully, trying to understand what is not being said. And in that process, something shifts. They become the ones adjusting, not you. They change their tone, their approach, their strategy, trying to find a way in. But you remain the same, measured, unrushed, unclear, by choice. This is what builds presence. Not loudness, not dominance, but control. Control over what is revealed and what is not. Because the moment you react fully, the moment you explain everything, the moment you remove all uncertainty, you become predictable again. And predictability is where control is lost. So the goal is not silence alone. It is selective clarity. You respond, but briefly. You acknowledge, but without depth. You engage, but without exposure. Just enough to remain present, but not enough to be defined. This balance is what keeps the shadow alive. And over time, it becomes natural. You no longer feel the need to explain everything. You no longer feel pressure to clarify every detail. You no longer rush to resolve tension, because you understand something most people don't. Not all tension needs to be resolved. Some tension creates power. It makes people pause, think, adjust. It slows them down. And when others slow down, you gain control of the pace. And the one who controls the pace controls the interaction. This is the deeper layer of the shadow. It doesn't just protect you. It influences others, quietly, without force, without effort. Because when you remain undefined, people move carefully around you. They choose their words more precisely. They hesitate before pushing. They think before acting. Not because you told them to, but because they cannot predict you. And unpredictability creates respect. Not loud respect, but cautious awareness. The kind that changes behavior, without confrontation. This is why maintaining the shadow matters. Because creating ambiguity once is not enough. It must be sustained, through consistency, through restraint, through control. And the more consistent you are, the stronger it becomes, until eventually, it becomes part of your presence. Not something you do, but something you are. A presence that is seen, but not fully understood. And what is not fully understood cannot be easily controlled. 5. Using ambiguity in real interactions. Understanding ambiguity is one thing. Using it in real moments is where it becomes power. Because theory is calm, but real interaction is pressure. A question is asked. Tone shifts. An accusation appears. And instantly, your instincts activate. Respond. Explain. Clarify. But this is where the shadow tactic begins. Not by speaking more, but by controlling how much you reveal. Step 1. Slow the moment. Before anything, you pause. Not dramatically, not noticeably, just enough to break the automatic reaction. Because most people answer immediately, and immediacy creates predictability. But when you pause, even briefly, you change the rhythm. You create space. And inside that space, you decide not what to say fully, but what not to say. Step 2. Respond without defining. When you speak, you don't give full clarity. You respond, but leave edges undefined. For example, instead of explaining, you say, "That's one way to see it." You haven't agreed. You haven't disagreed. You've remained present, without committing. Or, "I hear what you're saying." Again, acknowledgement without exposure. No position. No target. This is the core principle. You stay in the conversation, but outside of full definition. Step 3. Use questions to redirect. When pressure increases, don't explain. Redirect. A simple question shifts everything. What makes you think that? Now the focus moves. They are no longer analyzing you. They are explaining themselves. Or, what exactly are you trying to get at? Now they must define their position, not you. This breaks the pattern. Because instead of defending, you are observing. And observation is control. Step 4. Limit your language. The more you speak, the more you reveal. So you reduce. Short responses. Minimal detail. Neutral tone. Not cold. Controlled. Because long explanations create openings. More words mean more targets. But fewer words create fewer angles. And fewer angles mean less control for others. This is precision. Not silence alone, but selective speech. Step 5. Hold neutral emotion. Words are only part of the signal. Emotion reveals the rest. Tone, expression, body language. If your words are controlled, but your emotion reacts, the ambiguity breaks. So your state must match your strategy. Calm, steady, unrushed. No visible need to prove. No urgency to defend. Because urgency signals vulnerability. And vulnerability creates targets. But calm presence removes them. Step 6. Allow silence to work. After you respond, you don't rush to fill the space. You let silence exist. And silence does something powerful. It forces the other person to continue, to clarify, to explain, to reveal more, because most people cannot sit in silence. They feel the need to fill it, and in doing so, they give more information, more than they intended, more than you ever needed to ask for. This is the advantage. You speak less, and receive more. Step 7. Exit without resolution. Not every interaction needs an ending. Not every tension needs closure. Sometimes, you simply disengage. Not abruptly, not emotionally, but naturally. A shift in attention, a change in direction, a quiet exit, because staying too long invites pressure, but leaving at the right moment preserves control, and control is not about dominating the interaction. It is about choosing your level of involvement. The final realization. First, this feels unnatural. You will want to explain, clarify, be understood. But over time, something changes. You realize you don't need to be fully understood to remain in control. You don't need to explain everything to maintain your position. You don't need to react to stay present. And once that realization settles, your behavior shifts. You become more measured, more selective, more precise. You speak less, but with more effect. You reveal less, but maintain more control. And others begin to notice, not consciously, but instinctively. They become more careful, more aware, more hesitant, because they cannot fully read you. And what cannot be fully read cannot be easily manipulated. This is the silent advantage. Not loud, not obvious, but deeply effective. Because while others are trying to understand you, you are already in control of what they see and what they don't. This is how ambiguity becomes a weapon. Not through force, but through restraint. Not through silence alone, but through selective revelation. And once you master it, you are no longer reacting to the interaction. You are shaping it, quietly, from the shadows.